Schopenhauer, On the Basis of Morality, German, Über die Grundlage der Moral, is one of Arthur Schopenhauer's major works in ethics, in which he argues that morality stems from compassion. Schopenhauer begins with a criticism of Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, which Schopenhauer considered to be the clearest explanation of Kantian ethics. Let's see what else there is. It's not a very long article. Religions have promised a reward after death if a person behaved well. Governmental laws are motives for good behavior because they promise earthly rewards and punishments. Kant's categorical imperative claimed that a person's own behavior should be in accordance with a universal law. All of these, however, are ultimately founded on selfish egoism. If an action has as its motive an egoistic aim, wrote Schopenhauer, it cannot have any moral worth. So if it's about self-interest, personal self-interest, it's not really a great basis of morality, to paraphrase. Schopenhauer's doctrine was that morality is based on the everyday phenomenon of compassion, the immediate participation, independent of all ulterior considerations, primarily in the suffering of another, and thus in the prevention or elimination of it. Only insofar as an action has sprung from compassion does it have moral value, and every action resulting from any other motives has none. Compassion is not egoistic because the compassionate person does not feel different from the suffering person or animal that is seen. Even though the sufferer is experienced as an external being, I nevertheless feel it with him, feel it as my own, and not within me, but in another person. But this presupposes that to a certain extent I have identified myself with the other man, and in consequence, the barrier between the ego and the non-ego is for the moment abolished. End of the quote. Schopenhauer thus considered it to be true. Do you hear the bird all of a sudden starting singing at 4 in the morning? Schopenhauer thus considered it to be true that, quote, compassion as the sole non-egoistic motive is also the only genuinely moral one. Metaphysically, his explanation of morality is based on his monistic doctrine that all things are essentially the same. Everything is a manifestation of what is commonly called will, that is, urge, desire, striving, force, or energy. Now, this is an interesting paragraph about Schopenhauer's views on morality, which are very much a reverberation of the same sentiments expressed by people throughout the ages. In modern, right today, people are saying the same thing, and people have been saying the same thing for thousands of years. That all this authoritarian forms of morality that we get from religion and government, with the threats of punishment as the main motivation for our supposed good behavior or moral behavior. It's the same criticism and the same other themes that are also clear in these expressed sentiments. The notion of suffering and the reduction of suffering. Actually, I think Schopenhauer did take some interest in Eastern philosophies, such as Buddhism. I think he actually did get into studying some of these way ahead of a lot of other people. And this definitely is a theme in the whole Buddhism philosophy, is that recognition that suffering is one main aspect of our existence and the need to eliminate suffering, whether for ourselves or for others, is a basic moral question, basic philosophical question, which you'll see reflected in a song called God by John Lennon, soon after the Beatles broke up. And he probably paraphrased or quoted directly from somebody, because he did that sort of thing. But in any case, the line that he wrote was, God is a concept by which we measure our pain. And that's very much a reflection of this whole notion of particularly Buddhist religion or Buddhist philosophy, that the whole notion of being able to gauge suffering as a basic part of the moral compass. There you go, and there's the concept of God can be seen and defined in this manner. God is a concept by which we measure our pain. So pain is one very real aspect of our existence, or a very, very noticeable aspect of our existence that motivates a lot of our so-called moral attitudes. And what is the compassion? What is the identification? Which this monism that Schopenhauer is claimed in here to have been speaking of, is something that you hear people talking about. Universal oneness. Everything is part of the same thing. We are all expressions of the same, whatever it is. If is it the divine whatever the universal consciousness, we're all part of the same consciousness, and we just happen to be different physical manifestations of this body over here has this consciousness in their brain, and that's a little bit separated. It's like different files, or a different computer even, than another person over here that has their own files stored in their brain, but it's still part of the same complete consciousness, just as your computer, your internet connection, and everything that you experience on the internet is a slightly separated experience of the totality of everything that's on the internet, and you have a slightly personalized experience of the internet, but the internet itself is something large, encompassing everybody's experiences altogether, and it's not that different for any one of us, except that we approach it in different ways. And so we approach life from different angles, different perspectives, but we're all part of the same totality of what life is. And so compassion can be seen as a simple recognition of that totality. Just as the trillions of cells in your body, each can be considered a separate living organism, really. Each of the trillions and trillions of cells in your body is a separate single-celled organism. But they all go together to make up the singularity that is you. But you're made up of trillions of potentially individual singularities, and so the question is, do the cells of your body, do the individual cells of your body, in working together, consciously recognize that they are working together for a larger self? Or do they work independently, unconscious of the larger structure that they're a part of, and yet somehow that structure, that unified you, still manages to function as a unified self that you think of as myself? So that's just sort of a model for perhaps that's how we are. There might be billions or trillions of human beings, certainly there are trillions of animals, and we might all be part of the same singularity just as much as individual cells of our body. Now, some individual cells of our body, many of them, will never meet cells from another part of the body. They never come into direct contact, but we're still all part of the same body. Let's so Schopenhauer was way ahead. Oh, and then the other thing I want to mention is that compassion. Schopenhauer definitely mentioning that compassion is the basis of morality. And what is peculiar about this is, okay, in the end it says, everything is a manifestation of what is commonly called will. Now, Schopenhauer was kind of apparently perverted after his death in his native Germany by this perception that, oh, he's all about will, and what does this mean about the will, with supposedly Hitler claiming to have been an admirer of Schopenhauer's writings, when I'm absolutely certain that Schopenhauer himself, if he had been alive to see Hitler and to hear the kind of things that Hitler was expressing, would have despised Hitler. I really believe that Schopenhauer would have despised Hitler. In fact, there's an interesting connection. Even Wagner, the composer Wagner, who was alive during Schopenhauer's life, also claimed that he was inspired by Schopenhauer's writings. And apparently Schopenhauer kind of snubbed Wagner. Wagner sent an autographed copy of some of his, or one or some of his operas to Schopenhauer in appreciation of saying, I admire your works, and Schopenhauer just didn't reply for whatever reason, and it's seen as a possible snub of Wagner. And then Hitler comes along a couple generations later and claims to have been an admirer of both Wagner and Schopenhauer. But Hitler's interpretation of the whole notion of the will being the primary thing, and Hitler was really the opposite of the type of compassion that Schopenhauer is talking about. And Schopenhauer was, I think, a very gentle, sensitive person who would have despised everything that Hitler stood for, would have resented Hitler misinterpreting and misusing his theories and statements for Hitler's own uncompassionate, insensitive, completely egoistical attitude towards life. It's like Hitler was like the complete opposite of Schopenhauer, and yet, in his own crazy way, thought that he was an admirer of Schopenhauer, when Schopenhauer was the sort of person that Hitler would have had killed. And even his sentiments of reduction of suffering and compassion, and non-egoistic compassion, is the complete opposite of what Hitler interpreted this notion of the will to be. Hitler perverted Schopenhauer's statements into this: the dominant thing is the will, and we must have will, and we must dominate those who are less strong, and all this bullshit. And it's completely perverting, I believe, everything that Schopenhauer was trying to get across about compassion and not morality being based on compassion, and not being selfish, egotistically selfish and self-interested, and always concerned about what's in it for me. What am I getting out of it? And if it doesn't benefit me, then it's of no use to me. And so Hitler was the complete opposite of that. Hitler was, the only thing that matters is what's good for me, and screw everybody else. I'm sure that Schopenhauer would have despised Hitler even more than he, well, I don't know if he despised Wagner, but he would have definitely despised Hitler if he had been alive. Now, what got me looking up Schopenhauer in the first place? I was looking up when he was born in 1788, and this was 12 years. Okay, because the word self-evident. Schopenhauer said that all truth in our society passes through 3 stages, and the third stage, after being ridiculed and opposed, the final stage of truth is acceptance, where the truth becomes considered self-evident by the same people who mocked it and opposed it before it was commonly accepted. Self-evident, and that word self-evident was also written in the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So that was a dozen years before the birth of Schopenhauer. That phrase was used in the Declaration of Independence, saying that that these truths are self-evident, that all men are created equal and have inalienable rights, including, among others, the right to life, the right to freedom, and the right to the pursuit of happiness, which again is a derivative paraphrase of an earlier statement. The writers of the Declaration of Independence were familiar with the writings of John Locke, who had been writing earlier in that century. So not too long before a number of decades before the Declaration of Independence, but not too long that it wasn't within living memory of the people writing the Declaration of Independence, was the philosophical writings of John Locke, who said, I believe that he was the one who came up with the natural law, the phrase natural law, and he said that there's certain natural conditions that we can generalize for all people in a moral sense and in a social sense, that the right to life, the right to freedom, and the right to property, according to John Locke, were things that should be self-evident rights of any human being, that we should be entitled in any sane society, any just society, should guarantee us the right to be alive, the right to be free, and the right to property. The writers of the Declaration of Independence, or was it the Constitution? I'm too tired to look it up, but it was the same folks writing those anyhow. They didn't want to go that far in their revolution to guarantee property to everyone, because they did live in a society that supported slavery, and many of the writers of the Declaration and the Constitution were themselves slave owners, including Washington and Jefferson. So they didn't want to guarantee all people the right to actual freedom or property, because that would go against their own personal egoistical self-interest of owning slaves. So they paraphrased John Locke, and they rewrote his statement that it's natural for all people to have the rights to life, liberty, and property, and they crossed off property and substituted the pursuit of happiness. So they didn't want to. It's a disclaimer. They didn't want to give too much of a money-back guarantee that you have the right to happiness, and certainly not the right to property. But they wanted to say you have the right to try. You have the right to you have the right to buy a lottery ticket. You don't have the right to win, but you do have the right to buy a lottery ticket. Essentially, that's what they were saying. So all these so then the phrase self-evident, though, that these truths are self-evident, and the self-evident truths that the writers of the Declaration of Independence, or was it the Constitution, whatever, the self-evident truths that they were referring to referred to the philosophical statements of John Locke, which they referred to these as being self-evident. And then Schopenhauer, who was born a dozen years later, again used the term self-evident, and in connection with truth, with the added wisdom of recognizing, well, this is how society functions. This is how society manages perceptions, by dealing with different types of attitudes. How does our society deal with diversity of attitudes? Well, at first, what society does first is it laughs at those attitudes. It mocks them. It says, that's ridiculous. You're saying something different than what we're all supposed to believe, so you're crazy, or a liar, or full of crap, or stupid. And if you persist in it, we're going to even we'll call you a criminal, and we'll call you a terrorist, and we'll find some way to try to suppress you and destroy you in any way we can. And then if that still doesn't work, if we still don't manage to destroy you because what you're saying has too much validity, then eventually if you can't beat them, join them. And we will absorb your statements into our rhetoric, and it will be assimilated. And so then when resistance becomes futile, then you will become assimilated, and we will assimilate your opinions and attitudes, which we at first mocked and scoffed at and violently opposed, and then we'll say, oh yes, of course, everybody knows that. That's obvious. You don't have to be a genius to figure that one. Any child knows that. So that was the extra layer of wisdom that Schopenhauer put on the whole self-evident truth, natural law. And this brings it full circle, because the phrase natural law I first heard of because there was a natural law political party apparently created by the guru Maharishi, the Maharishi guy, that sexy Sadie that the Beatles spent a little time with, teaching them about meditation and mantras and Om and all that stuff. And this guy started a political party for peace, a worldwide political party called, in America, was called the Natural Law Party. And I voted for those. I voted for the Natural Law Party candidate in 2 elections. In 1996, when I first heard about them, and 2000. Now, if I had known that it was created by Maharishi, I might have been more skeptical. But back in 1996, you understand, that was before most of what you consider the internet existed. Wikipedia didn't exist. Google didn't exist, even. And I didn't have a computer in 1996, so even if it had existed, I wasn't able to look up Natural Law Party the way I'm able to look things up now on Wikipedia and Google. So I didn't know that much. So what I was able to know about the Natural Law Party was much scantier information, but what I did read about it sounded sensible. The candidate, John Hageland, made a lot of sensible statements about what's more important than figuring out how to punish criminals is how to prevent people from having to become criminals. And that made a heck of a lot of sense. Now, speaking a little bit more cynically, what didn't make that much sense, in my opinion, about John Hageland was some of his flaky Maharishi stuff about, oh, well, meditation will bring world peace. If everybody meditates and thinks peaceful thoughts, then the world will become more peaceful. And this is proven scientifically. It's been proven. We can tell you about it. It's bullshit. This meditation shit. But other than that, most of his statements were worlds and worlds and worlds apart as far as being more rational and sensible than any of the other politicians and political parties, and that's why I voted for them in 1996 and 2000. So, there's the concept of all this rambling, nonsense rambling, or not nonsense, but not entirely focused rambling about concepts about Schopenhauer and self-evident truths, comes from my trying to think of what would be a good name for a new political party. Again, I guess I would join the Natural Law Party if it still were active, which it kind of really isn't. It kind of fell apart, especially since Maharishi's death. And B, if I didn't have these objections to its flakiness, flaky Maharishi transcendental meditation stuff isn't exactly what I want to associate myself with, or identify with myself with. So how do you come up with a name for a new political party that will be a good name, that will establish the identity of the party and sort of distinguish it and sort of keep it on track, to keep the sort of people who would join that party to being the sort of people I would want joining, the sort of people who would who you would want to be participating in that party. What would be a good name? Natural Law Party was already used, and unless I decide to take that up, I wanted to come up with another name, and one name I thought of was Obvious Solutions. And after that I thought of, well, self-evident truths. So that's the full circle, the thoughts about self-evident truth, Schopenhauer talking about truth being self-evident, the Declaration of Independence mentioning self-evident truths, referring back to John Locke, and John Locke was the one who referred to these self-evident truths as the basis of what he called natural law. And I still don't know what I would want to call a political party, but I'm working on it. That's all.